Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review, and today it's something a bit different and new on the channel because I'm diving into power cables and power filters and conditioners for the first time ever. I have to admit that I've actually avoided power cables for quite some time because there's just so many other variables in setting up an audio system that I almost wanted to ignore the fact that these could potentially make a difference. And on that note, I just want to talk briefly about cognitive dissonance when we're talking about anything like this in the world of audio. I get that sometimes we don't want these things to make a difference because it adds a layer of complexity and difficulty when planning out your system, knowing where to spend your money and when and how much to prioritize. All of that stuff can be a lot to take in. And so I want to make something really clear up front. I don't ever recommend that people spend money on cables and these fine detailed tweaks until everything else in your system is in place. These types of tweaks, if they make a difference at all, and we'll get to that shortly, but these sorts of tweaks are those last 1, 2, 3% type changes that you make to a system when you've got the DAC, the amp, and the headphone or speakers that you really like. Those main components are always going to make a much bigger difference to the sound than things like cables, power filters, interconnect, all that sort of stuff. And so really my intention with sharing videos like this is to give you a chance to hear what I've experienced, decide if it's something that you want to explore for yourself, and either to shortcut the process of you having to work out which product's right for you, or to give you a sense of whether you want to go down the rat hole yourself and try some of this gear and decide for yourself if you like what you're hearing. While we're on the topic of that, I know that some people think that any talk about cables is just snake oil, and so I wanted to flag the fact that I came into this very skeptical. On one hand, it makes sense to me that the power coming into any device is super important because that power is what feeds everything the device does. A DAC can't produce an output signal without incoming power. An amplifier can't produce a louder output signal without incoming power. And so on one hand, it makes logical sense that the quality of that power should make a difference, but at the same time, all of these good quality devices are built with filters within their power supplies that should theoretically make the quality of the power absolutely irrelevant. So I was definitely skeptical, but also open-minded to explore it and try it for myself. And as you'll hear as we go through, the results I heard aren't always cut and dry. So hopefully you can approach this with an open mind. If you can't approach this with an open mind, then please just refrain from commenting, refrain from watching. Differences of opinion and perspectives are always welcome, but blatant, flat-out black and white stances and abuse of other people or me on the channel are just not acceptable. So please just choose to not comment or not watch if this is a topic that you really disagree with and you don't want to have a part of. With all that said, I've got one more disclaimer. It's going to be really quick, and that is to say that I have tested these with some cheaper equipment, but that doesn't mean I recommend buying an expensive cable to drive cheap equipment. The reason I tested it was to see if there's any difference between expensive gear, cheaper gear, and different types of power supplies. But as I said at the very outset, I don't recommend investing in cables before you've got everything else in place. And so with all that said, let's dive in and take a look at some Supra power cables and the Supra power filter. I'll introduce them after the B-roll. I've essentially got 4.5 products that we're talking about today. And I say 4.5 because one of them is just one of these cables with different connector plugs connected to it. And so to quickly introduce you to the products, I'm going to start with the biggest and most expensive, and that's the Supra MD-08DC power board, which is also a DC filter and a surge protector as well. You can get these in an 8 or a 6 socket version, so it's the MD-08 is the 8 socket, MD-06 is the 6 socket of course. And the 8 socket version retails for roughly $850 US. I say roughly because one thing with Supra is the amount of distribution and availability is a little bit patchy. And so it's probably going to depend where in the world you are and who your retailers and distributors are, exactly the pricing that you're going to get. But think around about $850 US for the 8 socket version. The reason a device like this exists is for a few reasons. Firstly, as I mentioned, it's a surge protector, so it's going to prevent your expensive gear from getting blown up in the event of a power surge. That alone is going to be enough reason for some people to buy these, regardless of any sonic differences, if there are any, and we'll get to that shortly. The way the board is designed also reduces electromagnetic radiation from coming out of the power board and also getting into the power board as well. And that's because every single electronic device that you have produces a degree of electromagnetic radiation. And whilst the amounts that are produced by all of these different devices have to come within a standard that makes it safe for prolonged exposure for humans, there is an argument that the less electromagnetic radiation that you're surrounded to, the better it could be for your general health and well-being. I'm not going to get into that. There's very mixed evidence on how much is and is not safe, whether it's actually necessary to have none at all. All those things are very debatable. I'm not going to get into that. But my point is, at least if you're buying something like the LoRad MD-08DC power board, you know that it's going to be minimizing the amount of that radiation in your environment, and it's also preventing any of that type of interference getting into your power circuit and therefore more easily getting into your audio devices. The final thing that this power board does is it filters out any DC content within the AC mains power. So DC is a consistent signal in the power, whereas AC is meant to be consistently fluctuating at 50 or 60 Hz depending on where you are. The reason DC is a problem is that in most households, you're going to have many different devices that have been plugged in and switched on at different times. So they're not all running in sync, and that means that they're putting a tiny bit of voltage or interference to the normal cycle of voltage back into your home circuit. According to Supra's website, and keep in mind Supra are a very scientifically based company, the DC component that can be created within your home mains power circuit from all the different devices having that little bit of interference, that can reach up to a few volts worth of DC. And if we're working with audio devices that are in any way sensitive to that, then that could be an issue, and so theoretically, filtering it out could have an impact. Now notice that I'm still saying could because I don't know for sure if all of these things stack up in a real world situation. I don't know if what I've heard and experienced when using the Supra board has anything to do with what I've just told you, but that's the theory behind why these boards exist. Moving on then to the power cables, and as I said, I've got sort of 3.5 versions here. Starting off with the basic model first, and I want to say thanks to the distributor for Supra here in Australia and New Zealand for sending me these little samples of the cable that's been cut. We've got 3 different versions. You've got a 3x1.5 gauge version, you've got a 3x2.5 gauge version, and then finally there's a 3x2.5 gauge version with silver plated cable. So basically you've got a thin version, 2 thick versions, but one of those has silver-plated cores. And then the extra addition is that you can buy these with Furutech high-quality mains plugs attached. To give you an idea of pricing on these cables, the thinner version cable comes in at about $130 for a 2 meter cable. These are US dollars, and again, they're just estimates. The thicker standard cable comes in at about $160 US dollars for a 2 meter cable, so roughly an extra $15 per meter. The silver plated version comes in at $190, so again, another $15 per meter over and above the standard 2.5 version. And then when you add a pair of the Furutech plugs, it's going to come in at roughly an extra $350 to $400 more because those plugs are very expensive. Now to be clear, you don't have to buy these with the Furutech plugs. It's entirely optional. You can decide if you think it's worth it or not worth it. I'm just going to share with you what I heard in trying the cables with and without those plugs attached. Just like the power board, these cables are all designed with that low radiation intent in mind. So the way the cable geometry is set up, in other words, the way the internal wires are twisted and paired together, that's going to help to cancel out electromagnetic radiation put out from the cable, but it's also shielded to prevent electromagnetic radiation from other things getting into the cable. So once again, it's all about keeping any sort of radiation low, and that's theoretically going to protect that noise from getting into your devices, but also make your overall home environment a better and safer place. What I was personally interested in though was whether it altered the sound at all. And so let's now step through a whole range of devices. I'll explain why I've chosen each device as we go, because there was a very specific reason I wanted to check each thing out and see if the cables had the same impact or no impact on all the different types of device. And we're going to start off with the Chord DAVE. I'm lucky enough to have a DAVE here for review at the moment, and so I thought what better device to test these on than one of the most revealing and transparent DAC headphone amp combos in the world. While testing the DAVE, I was using Wild Horses by Rolling Stones, and so what I've done is I've used the exact same track for all of my listening on each device. I've rotated the tracks through, as I'll tell you, for each different device, but for this one device, that being the Dave, I've only listened to wild horses, so everything stayed nice and consistent. And my first test was to see if this plain old stock power cord here, this is just a generic power cord that came with something else, to see if this power cord sounds any different from one of these power cords when connected to the Dave. And so my testing was using this power cord and the 1.5 or the thinner basic version of the Supra cables. What I found when I plugged in the Supra cable was the sound was distinctly thicker, richer and more forward, and not necessarily better if I'm honest. I felt like in some ways the stock cable had a better sense of clarity and openness compared to the Supra cable, and that kind of surprised me. As much as I didn't know what to expect and I was a bit skeptical, my expectations were that if there was a difference, it should have been better, but it wasn't really that clear cut. As I jumped back and forth between the two cables, what I found was that with the stock cable, I preferred the sense of clarity and openness and separation that I was hearing, and that was coming from a sense of extra treble energy that was giving that sense of clarity and space. Whether it was actually good quality sound or just a bit of extra graininess, I'm not sure, but the end result was that in some ways I was preferring the sound of the stock cable. But what also became clear to me was that there was a sense of less refinement in the sound. So even though tonally and in general terms I probably preferred the stock cable, it was clear that there was a sense of smoothness and refinement to the sound. There was a sense that the Supra cable was doing something to keep noise, distortion, interference, one of those sorts of factors, to a much lower level. In wild horses, things like the guitars and the snare just sounded a little bit too edgy from the stock cable, whereas it went a bit too thick and rich in some ways on the Supra, but there was very clearly a difference. I just couldn't pick necessarily which one I preferred. To sum it up, I'd say that the sound quality was better from the 1.5, that's the Supra cable, but I tended to prefer the presentation, so that little bit of sense of space and clarity, from the stock cable, and that's where it got a bit tricky. Now, I'd started all of this off just connecting these cables straight to a generic, normal, cheap power board, and so my next test was to see what happened if I tried those same cables running out of the MD-08DC power board. And I have to admit, I was really shocked at what I heard when I connected them up to the power board, and that's because it was a much more dramatic change in the sound than what I heard by swapping the cables. Going from the cheap generic power board over to the Supra power board, all of the sound opened up. There was a much greater sense of space and smoothness of the sound, but without that sense of richness and thickness that I heard with the 1.5 connected to the stock power board. Using the stock cable, so the black one here, with the Supra power board did improve that sense of graininess that I spoke about before. It took some of the edge off things like the guitars and the snares in wild horses. But what I found when using the Supra power board was that the Supra cable was suddenly a much better listen than the stock cable. I'm not sure why that is. Maybe the Supra cable is carrying more accurately what's coming from the mains power, and therefore by filtering it, you're hearing more benefit of that because you're not adding any distortion picked up by the wire. I don't know what the cause is, and when I say distortion, I mean that in a very catch-all way. Any kind of noise, interference, extra stuff that shouldn't be there. I don't know if maybe the stock cable's still picking that up, and therefore it's degrading what's coming from the Supra power board, whilst the Supra power cable maybe was showing me all of the bad stuff that was going on in the mains power, until it was then connected to the Supra board and cleaning it up. Hopefully that makes sense. Regardless of why I think it may or may not be happening though, what I heard was that the filter was still an improvement on the stock cable, but had a greater improvement when used with the Supra 1.5. Strangely, and I've kind of alluded to this but I haven't clarified it, but when I said before using the 1.5 cable on its own, things got a bit thick and a bit overly kind of congested and forward. When using it with the Supra power board, none of that was there. It was just a cleaner, more open sound with more space. It was smooth but not thick. It was just a much better overall experience. I personally found it extremely interesting that the 1.5 cable was transformed by the filter board and went from being comparable to the stock cable when connected direct to mains to suddenly being clearly superior to the stock cable when connected to the filter board. What this also showed me was that for me, with a device like the Dave, the inclusion of the power board in the circuit was more impactful initially than the power cable, and so if you were going to look at buying one or the other, I'd probably say to start with the power board, recognising it's a much more expensive initial purchase, but it can also filter for multiple devices. So you can actually be providing 7 lots of filtering for 7 different devices, rather than one power cable for just one device. So I think in terms of value for money, they actually end up roughly the same. Maybe the power board's even slightly better, because keep in mind that you can also use it to protect other devices like TVs, computers, from surges and the like. 2 little side notes while we're talking about the power board and the filtering and stuff like that. The first one is that you might have just noticed that I said you could filter 7 devices. And actually I should have said 6 now that I think of it, because with the MD-08DC, 2 of the sockets are unfiltered. And the theory behind that is that it might actually be beneficial to run certain large, powerful amplifiers without applying the filtration. I believe the thinking behind that is that the filtration can affect the ability for the amplifier to draw the current it needs as it needs it, but I haven't delved into that because I'm a headphone guy. I don't have big powerful amplifiers to try that with, but it is worth keeping in mind that if you're buying an MD-08DC, then what you're getting is 6 filtered sockets in the power board and 2 unfiltered. And if you're buying the 6 socket version, you're getting 5 filtered and 1 unfiltered. So do keep that in mind. If you've got more than 6 devices you want filtration for, you'll need more than just the 08. You might need 2 06s, for instance. The other side note that I want to mention is that because of the logistics of how I set all this up, I was actually running the MD-08DC off a power board from the mains power, so it went out of the mains power into a generic power board and then into the Supra power board, and that may have slightly reduced its performance by having that little stock power board in the middle, but when I tried it directly out of the main socket on the wall, the difference was marginal if there at all. So I do believe it's probably preferable to connect it straight to your mains wall socket, but if you can't do that, you could actually run this off an extension lead or a power board without a major impact on performance. But let's keep rolling before this turns into a 2-hour marathon, and now talk about some of the different power cables. So having established that the filter was very, very valuable in the setup, my next question was, what difference does it make going from the 1.5 to the 2.5 and then to the 2.5 silver plated? And I'm going to keep this fairly brief and not go into a huge amount of depth. And that is to say that going from the 1.5 to the 2.5 was a slight improvement. It's probably worth the extra $30 I think for that upgrade, assuming you've got a good system in place and you're looking to squeeze every last bit out of it. But the reality is it's not a huge jump going from the 1.5 to the 2.5, it's an incremental step. And specifically, it was a slight improvement in things like clarity and detail in the sound, but it wasn't a massive leap. Going from the 2.5 to the 2.5 silver plated though, that was a more significant shift. There was a tonal change and a presentation change when adding the silver plating to the power cable. Suddenly the vocals from the silver plated cable became more forward and more focused, but not in the sense that it congested the sound like say my original 1.5 test. What it was doing was it brought everything more forward in the soundstage, and it made the soundstage feel a little bit less kind of deep. It probably flattened a little bit, but it created much more definition in where each sound and each instrument was placed. So what you were trading off in overall soundstage size, you're getting back, and probably then some, in the image focus and the definition of sounds. For example, in Wild Horses, at around the 1 minute mark, there's some picking of an acoustic guitar in the left channel, and when I moved to the silver-plated cable, that became wonderfully tactile and present and clear in a way that it wasn't with the non-silver-plated. Now, to make it clear, I'm not saying that the silver-plated cable made the sound better so much. I'm not saying it's suddenly adding something to the system, so much as I think it was allowing the Dave to actually bring the most out of what it was doing. So by not getting in the way, by not bringing any interference into the system, whatever it is that's going on, it was allowing the Dave to do its thing, and that's why it sounded so good. And I say that just to clarify that I'm not suggesting you can buy the 2.5 silver-plated cable from Supra, plug it into a basic generic kind of $200 all-in-one unit and expect amazing things. But what it has shown me is that if you have a great system like the Dave and you connect it using a quality cable from a quality filter like these Supra ones, then you can expect even more magical things. But that then led me to thinking about the Furutech version with the high quality plugs at each end, and so I connected the 2.5 silver plated cable with Furutech plugs as my final frontier. And much like the shift from the 1.5 to the 2.5, I'd say the shift from the non-Furutech SPC cable to the Furutech SPC cable was again a fairly subtle shift. I felt like it brought just a touch more space to the sound and smoothed things out just a little bit further. What that does mean in some ways is that you might be losing a tiny sense of attack, but I think that's actually because it's improving the sound quality, and that sometimes extra sense of attack is coming from noise and grain in the system rather than actually pristine sound quality. My takeaway from all this is that much like the 1.5 to 2.5 shift, I'd say that if you're going for absolute maximum premium sound quality, the Furutech plug is probably worthwhile, but I don't think it's entirely essential. When you think about the fact that you could buy 2 extra cables basically for the price of those plugs, I think it would be better to have more of your devices connected with quality cables than to have, say, just one with a quality cable with the Furutech plugs. And so if you're in a position where you can put Furutech plugs in all of them, absolutely you're going to get the best possible sound, but don't feel like it's absolutely necessary. And so having played around with a full-on flagship product in the Dave, My next question was, I wonder if the same things hold true for a much cheaper and therefore much less revealing setup. And so I grabbed the Topping DX5. There were a couple of reasons I grabbed the Topping. One of them is I know that it uses an internal switch mode power supply, and I was interested to see how these sorts of cables and filtering perform with a switch mode power supply versus a linear power supply. I have no idea what's inside the Dave, so I didn't even think about power supplies for that one. But I wanted to hook up the DX5 partly because I know it's got switch mode, and also partly because I wanted to see if these sorts of cables had any influence on a cheap basic unit. A very good unit, but a cheap and basic one. My test track for all my DX5 testing was Black by John Batiste, and I started once again with the stock cable versus 1.5 cable test, and heard very similar things. I don't know if the improvement was quite as great as it was with the Dave. In other words, the gap from the stock cable to the 1.5 was probably a little bit smaller, but there was definitely a difference. And once again, using the 1.5 cable from the Supra power board produced a clearly superior sound than the stock cable from the Supra power board. As I played around with all the same mixture of cables, so each time going from the lower level to the next level up just one step at a time, what I heard with the DX5 was identical to what I heard with the Dave. And so what that tells me is not that you need to go out and spend the same amount on cables as you have on a DX5, but rather that it doesn't really matter what the device is, it seems that the cables can have similar impacts, at least when it comes to DACs. It also showed me again that I think the power filter has a greater overall impact than the cable on its own, and so again I would recommend, unless you are just running an all-in-one, then it might not make sense, but if you're running at least a few audio devices in your chain, then I do think it's worth going for the filter board before you start paying for the cables. And so at this point it was clear to me that if you're using these cables and filters on a DAC, then it's absolutely worth getting whichever one is most comfortable to you price-wise, because I do think the sound improves at each level up the rung. But there was one more DAC that I wanted to try, and that was the Schiit Bifrost 2. And I specifically chose the Bifrost 2 because it's an affordable but high quality DAC, and most importantly, it uses a linear power supply. So I fired up Addicted to Love by Tina Turner live at Camden Palace, and what I heard going from the stock cable to the 1.5 cable was actually the opposite to what I heard with the Dave and the DX5. And that is that when I went to the 1.5 cable now, I was hearing a brighter, cleaner sound than the stock cable. If you remember what I said about the Dave and the DX5, the 1.5 cable became more thick and congested, a little bit more forward, and a little bit more closed in. With the Bifrost 2, it was the exact opposite. The sound was a bit thicker and richer, and not in a good way, with the stock cable, and then the 1.5 cable brought a sense of clarity and openness. What I found when I added the power board to the setup of the Bifrost 2 was again much the same as I'd heard with the Dave and the DX5, which was that it does filter out some of the extra glare and the graininess from the sound. But the end result for me was that I was still hearing the 1.5 cable as being a bit sharper and harsher overall on the Bifrost 2, with the stock cable being a bit smoother overall, with a bit less space but potentially a more enjoyable sound. And it was at this point, because this was so different from what I'd heard from the Dave and the DX5, that I thought maybe it was actually the track. And so I changed tracks on the same album, so still the Tina Turner album I'd started with, but now I was listening to Proud Mary instead. And what I heard after changing the track was that the 1.5 cable was clearly doing a better job. It had a slightly more energetic sound, but on Proud Mary, that was actually a good thing. It wasn't grainy and harsh, it was just bringing more energy. The stock cable sounded smoother, but clearly more congested overall as well. And so it was interesting that the tonality of the 1.5 versus the stock cable was different, depending on whether I was using a switch mode power supply device like the DX5, or a linear power supply device like the Bifrost 2. In both cases, I think the 1.5 cable with the Supra power board was preferable to the stock cable with the Supra power board, but without the power board in place, it was a little bit more of a toss-up. The next test I tried was to jump straight to the 2.5 standard cable with the 2.5 silver-plated cable, and that was largely because the gains going from the 1.5 to the 2.5 are minimal. As I said before, if you can do it, I think it's worth doing it, but the big question for me was what happens when I add the silver-plated version? And on this occasion I heard the exact same thing from the Bifrost 2 that I'd heard from the other two DACs, the DX5 and the Dave. And that is that the 2.5 silver-plated cable brought the sound a little bit forward, but improved the definition of everything. So again, the overall sense of soundstage space reduced slightly, but the separation and definition of sounds in space was definitely upgraded. And so this really just confirmed for me that when it comes to DACs, something like the filter power board is the best first step, but upgrading the power cables does have a significant impact too. Reiterating the fact that I don't recommend buying these until the rest of your system's in place, But if you're happy with your system, you're looking for that next little tweak, then I do think the Supra power board and Supra cables are all fantastic. I would personally choose for a DAC to go with the silver plated cable if you can, but any of them are going to be better than the stock cables that come with the devices. And so now it's time for a change of pace to look at amplifiers. And I was very curious to see if amplifiers had the same benefits from these cables as DACs do, because they're very different devices. A DAC is operating largely in the digital domain and outputting a fairly low level signal, whereas an amplifier is entirely analog and it's looking to output a much higher current signal. Now, if we're talking headphone amplifiers, we're still talking in the milliamps in almost all cases, but if we're comparing it to a DAC, there are higher current requirements. And so my first test was to use the Sparkos Labs Aries. This is a really high quality, super transparent and relatively powerful headphone amp. For all my testing of the Aries, I was using Love Is a Game by Adele, and as with all the other tests, I started off with the stock cable up against the 1.5 from Supra. Even without the filter board, it was absolutely abundantly clear that the 1.5 cable was a clear and easy upgrade from the stock cable on this occasion. So unlike the DACs where I was a little bit mixed as to which I preferred, they both had their benefits and drawbacks, with the amplifier with the Sparkos Labs Aries at least, I was absolutely comfortably convinced that the Supra 1.5 cable was clearly better than the stock. Some of the reasons for that is that the opening strings in Love Is a Game were much more textured and clear when using the 1.5. It was like there was a bit of a veil or a haze that was removed with the upgraded cable. Likewise, Adele's voice was more clearly separated and focused in the soundstage with the 1.5 cable, and the separation of Adele's voice from those strings was clearer and more easy to hear. And so when it comes to the amp, it was much more clear cut that the upgrade cables are immediately beneficial regardless of filtration and regardless of which cable you buy. Assuming of course that the high level cables sounded better, and we'll get to that in a moment. When I added the MD-08DC to the mix, what I found was quite interesting. It definitely improved the sound from the stock cable, but I feel like the cable change on this occasion was more impactful than adding the filter. And what I mean by that is I feel like the improvement I got going from the stock cable to the 1.5 cable without the filter, I feel like that improvement was a greater step forward than adding the filter with a stock cable. So it goes a bit against what I heard with the DACs, and as I said at the beginning, it kind of makes sense because they're operating quite differently. To be clear, the 1.5 cable plus the filter is still clearly superior to the stock cable plus the filter, and it's still superior to the 1.5 cable without the filter. So in other words, putting both in the chain is still beneficial, but if you were looking at an amp like the Aries and you could only buy the filter or the cable, on this occasion, I probably would say to buy the cable. Of course, if you're running something like an Aries, you've probably got a high quality DAC, and that's going to benefit from the filter, so suddenly the filter board is worth considering. But I found it very interesting that there are variables depending on the device you're driving, what sort of power supply is built into that device. It's not as clear cut as cables are automatically better or filter is automatically better. It varies from device to device. Keeping the filter in place and going from the 1.5 cable to the thicker 2.5 cable, and things again just got incrementally better. The tonality was still exactly the same as the 1.5 cable, but with the 2.5, all of the separation was a bit better still. There was a slightly better sense of clarity and detail. So again, much like the DACs, it was just an incremental improvement of everything I'd already heard. But where it was different from the DAC is I think the gain was slightly greater with the 2.5. In other words, the improvement, if it was going from say a 7 out of 10 to a 7.5 out of 10 with the DACs, then moving from the 1.5 to the 2.5 on the amp went from a 7 to a full 8 out of 10. It was just that little bit better again than what I'd heard on the DACs. Moving to the 2.5 cable versus the 2.5 silver plated cable, and what I heard once again was that reduction in soundstage size, but improvement in overall clarity and separation of all the sounds. In Love Is a Game, there's some toms and some percussion that are kind of back in the mix a little bit, and they became wonderfully tactile and clear and present while still in the background. But they became so wonderfully defined in the mix, it was thoroughly enjoyable to listen to when the Aries was powered by the 2.5 silver plated cable. And so then the final test was of course the 2.5 silver plated with the Furutech plugs, and again I would say it was just another nice incremental upgrade. It was like the Furutech plugs allow the cable and the sound imparted by whatever power is coming through that cable, it was like it allowed it to get further out of the way. It just made everything sound purer, more natural, more lifelike. The tonality was unchanged, so everything I described about the silver plated cable, that just became more evident, still smooth and clean and enjoyable with the Furutech plugs. And so at this point what was clear to me was that the power filter is an excellent addition for any audio devices. The power cables are also an excellent addition, but which power cable you choose may actually vary. If you're all about soundstage space and depth, you might not want to choose the silver-plated cables. But if for you it's about the ultimate sense of clarity and definition of sounds and separation, albeit in a slightly smaller soundstage, then the silver-plated cable is definitely a great choice. And then the Furutech plugs are kind of just the icing on top that improves whatever the cable's already doing. So I'll let you decide how that works for you, what you might want, what you might not want in your system, but hopefully I've clarified for you how the different cables stack up and how the filters stack up. What I haven't yet clarified though, and what I wanted to, was what impact the power filter board, the MD-08DC, what impact that has on a switch mode power supply. And so I pulled out the recently reviewed Burson Conductor GT. This is a super duper all-in-one, hugely powerful headphone amp and high quality DAC all-in-one. I pulled that out and fired it up using Burson Audio's 5 amp supercharger, which is a switch mode power supply. What I was particularly interested in here is that this is a wall wart style supply, so it's plugging directly into the board. You can't get any of the benefits in those power supplies of these sorts of cables. And I was curious to see what it did with something like that switch mode power supply plugged direct into the board. Listening to You're Vibing Me by Brad Meldau, and I immediately and obviously heard a greater sense of detail and space when using the supercharger coming off the filter board. After about the 2-minute mark in You're Vibing Me, there's some quite busy passages of multiple instruments going on, and everything was just so easily separated when using the filter board compared to when I didn't have it there. It made the ability to hear all the different sounds and kind of pick them out in space, it made that so much easier. And interestingly, what I found as I continued to listen was that having the filter board in there with the supercharger, it made the sound just both effortless and easy to listen to, but also better for critical listening. So I could more easily relax and enjoy the music, but also when I wanted to, I could then more easily listen into the music and pull it apart if I wanted to. And that again supports what I said earlier, that if you do have multiple devices and you're thinking about power cables and power filters, my recommendation would be to absolutely start with the Supra power board. I'm going to talk in a second about a different power supply solution, but if you're in the market for power upgrades, I definitely think the Supra MD-06DC or MD-08DC is a fantastic first step. It's going to improve the sound based on my testing of anything and everything you plug into it. Now, speaking of different power boards, I've heard in the past that sometimes power filters, power conditioners, those sorts of things can actually be harmful to the sound rather than beneficial. And I can't stress enough that I heard no sense of that from any of my testing of the Supra MD-08DC. But one of the comparisons I wanted to make was with the Thor PS10 power station. The Thor PS10 is an Australian design product. I think it's only available here in Australia, but it's an interesting example of a device that's designed to deliver a consistent, in our case 240 volts, to all of your products. So it's going to take, say, a 235, 246 volt incoming feed, whatever your mains voltage coming in is, and it fluctuates throughout the day. It's going to take whatever's coming in and regenerate that to make sure that all of your devices are always seeing the correct voltage and is theoretically a perfect sine wave. So what an AC signal should look like. On paper, it sounds like that could only be a good thing. And so I was curious to see if what I heard from the Thor PS10 was comparable or different or the same as what I heard from the Supra. And so I took 3 of the devices I've just tested with the Supra power board and tried them with the PS10 to compare directly with the Supra. So I did this as a separate test. This wasn't based on memory. I jumped between the PS10 and the Supra power board for each of these tests. And starting off with the Burson Conductor that I just talked about, this is the Conductor GT, the sound when I was using the PS10 was noticeably more congested than it was with the Supra. I was listening to Battle Lines by Bob Moses for all 3 of these tests, and what I found was that the percussive upper frequencies that are used to kind of drive the rhythm in Battle Lines, when I was using the supercharger connected to the PS10, so the supercharger being the power supply for the Conductor GT, when I was using that connected up to the PS10, what I found was that it somehow blunted or somehow muddied that high frequency percussive sound. And ultimately what I found was the sound from the PS10 was definitely degraded compared to when it came from the Supra. And in fact, it may have been degraded compared to when I plugged the supercharger direct into the mains wall socket. So I definitely think there's some truth when people say that some of these power devices are actually bad for your audio quality. I think that's definitely true. The Supra MD-08DC definitely had none of those issues. It was only ever an improvement with anything I plugged into it for this testing. But the Thor PS10, not so much. When I plugged in the Sparkos Aries amplifier and jumped back and forth between the PS10 and the Supra board was miles and miles ahead better. I didn't compare the PS10 to see if it was worse than, say, a direct mains connection, but there's no doubt for me that if you were going to be buying some kind of filter and surge protection, and it's for your audio gear, you absolutely shouldn't choose the PS10 if you can choose the Supra instead. Finally, I also tried the DAVE again, and again the results were a little bit underwhelming for the PS10, while stellar once again when using the MD-08DC. Specifically what I heard was that when connected up to the PS10, I felt like there was just a little bit of graininess and edginess and a bit less space from the DAVE. And to be clear, these things weren't close. It wasn't like I was sitting there going, maybe it's different, maybe it's not. It was a small shift, but it was a very obvious and very definite shift. If I thought it was close enough to be irrelevant, much like I talked about with the 1.5 to the 2.5 shift, I would be saying so. But the reality is it's not that close. It's a big enough step that it's significant, even if it's not a huge step. And hopefully that makes sense. So my takeaway from all of this, and thank you for watching through this, I hope it's all made sense. There was a lot of ground to cover, lots of variations to cover, but hopefully where you've come to at the end of all of this is to understand that in my opinion, the Supra LoRad power devices, including the MD-06 or 08DC filtering power board, and also the LoRad power cables, being the 1.5 gauge, the 2.5 gauge, the 2.5 silver plated, and then when you buy them with the Furutech plugs added on, I do think that all of those are very worthwhile upgrades if your system is basically complete. I think you could definitely make an argument if you know you're going to be building your system over time, you could definitely make an argument for starting out with the power board as soon as you're ready, because it's protecting your devices from surges and also it's giving you multiple power sockets that you probably need anyway. So if you know you're going to be building and growing your system, start with the power board. It's going to help give you the best possible sound you can get from every device along your journey. But to reiterate what I said at the start, definitely you're going to get more impact spending that money on better devices. So I'm not recommending you start with the power board. I'm saying that if you chose to, it's going to be with you for a very long time and it is going to improve everything you plug into it. And so hopefully I provided some clarity in this very interesting world of power cables. No doubt there is a whole lot more to understand about how it all works, about which products work better and worse compared to others. But as a starting point, I can definitely say, with no comparison to anything other than the stock cables, I definitely think the Supra LoRad power cables are a great choice. And I also think that their filtering power board is a great option as well. As I said earlier, the distribution and the availability of Supra cables I find to be a bit hit and miss. So what I'll put down below in terms of links is a link through to Genving, that's the parent company for Supra, and you can at least read up on what these products are, how they all work, what the science is behind them and the theories behind them, and then you can go out and find a retailer if you're interested. So I'll wrap things up there. Hopefully you found this review useful and informative. If you have, I'd love it if you consider subscribing if you haven't already. And most importantly, please hit the like button. It really helps the channel out. But for now, let me leave it to the music. So happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.